Steven Crowder also does not know any of this stuff and doesn't care. Steven Crowder is just trying to troll you, and you guys are taking the bait in an unsophisticated way. But the fact that Steven Crowder says the Nazi Party were socialists and that he's a buffoon, he makes an ass of himself in arguing this, that doesn't mean that your role on the left is to have a knee-jerk reaction where you argue the opposite just because it's the opposite of what this idiot said. Hey guys, two wrongs don't make a right. I know that's, a moral to put to a story that's so banal that grown-ups don't want to hear it in a sophisticated YouTube video about sophisticated political philosophy, but sometimes it's important to just say that. Two wrongs do not make a right. I've lately seen some really intellectually dishonest and, from my perspective, immoral videos from voices on the left that are out of convenience misrepresenting and lying about the history of fascism, the far right, and the Nazi Party. And I know they are only telling these half-truths and lies because the opposition they're up against is even stupider and even more dishonest. So this is thrown into relief, most notably, by a left-wing channel called Three Arrows, attempting to take on the misinformation campaign represented by Steven Crowder and Dinesh D'Souza. Now, Steven Crowder is a buffoon, and there's a difference between being a buffoon and being stupid. However stupid he may be, he is acting stupid. He's basically playing a fictional character. I mean, to criticize the political views of Dinesh D'Souza, this is like, to criticize Bugs Bunny. To what extent are you fencing with, a cartoon? It's ridiculous. And sure, someone like Dinesh D'Souza is a complete joke. But what are you doing when you're an ostensibly respectable historian like Three Arrows, and you are making claims and statements like this that are a mix of the misleading, the intellectually dishonest, and the totally untrue? And I'm going to be 100% honest and say that the idea to put this video out on the internet was first put in my mind by everyone's favorite lowbrow, ranting pseudo-intellectual, the Amazing Atheist, TJ Kirk. And the Amazing Atheist is a very, very influential thinker and pundit here on YouTube. And anyone who's been on YouTube for about 10 years, knows him and knows his influence. But we also know that he's toward the same end of the spectrum as Steven Crowder, in that he's mostly about having a kind of, pugnacious and entertaining delivery. And he puts very little time and effort into researching facts. There have been a couple of exceptions over the years. I remember when the Elliot Rodger case broke, he actually took the time to read Elliot Rodger's entire manifesto and do research and reporting on that, which I appreciated because it was a stark contrast to what was going on in the mainstream press. But if you think that guy sat down and did even 5 minutes of research before recently making statements about the history of the Nazi Party and fascism, you got to be joking. I don't think he even checked a Wikipedia article. So what is the bone of historical contention here, and why does it matter so much? Well, the issue is whether or not the right wing are using this insincerely and invidiously. Because of course they are. Of course someone like Steven Crowder is basically just being a troll. The issue is, to what extent was the Nazi Party of Germany actually socialist? For those of you who don't know, the word Nazi is an abbreviation of National Socialist. There are many errors made by the well-intentioned left-wing people. Some of them are errors and some of them are intentional manipulations. But first and foremost, I already talked about this aspect in an earlier video, what they're doing is deleting Italy from the history of European fascism. The extent to which people in the 21st century ignore Italy in the 20th century. And Italy is not the only country that gets ignored this way. The history of Greece in the 20th century. There are many parts of Europe where even within the white Western European world, history is made out to only involve England, France, and Germany to a ridiculous extent. I think any outsider, like a Chinese person or Japanese person studying this history, I think many outsiders would say this is a kind of racism, isn't it? Is there something Northern Europeans have against Mediterranean Europeans where they feel like history only happens on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean and not on the shores of the Mediterranean? Now, if you go back a few centuries, of course, Italy is the most important country in the world, and it's the main focus of European history. But in this period, again, whether it's through intellectual dishonesty or whether it's a sincere blind spot, I don't think any of these people are actually racist against Italians, don't get me wrong. But the extent to which Italy has been deleted from the recounting and reconceptualization of this history is astounding. And you cannot understand the bizarre historical concoction of 20th century fascism, of quote-unquote National Socialism in Germany. You cannot understand it without understanding what happened in Italy in the lead up to World War I, during World War I, and in response to World War I, and then the rise of fascism in Italy in the interwar years thereafter, with the unique historical character of Mussolini. All right? So, look, obviously, Steven Crowder also does not know any of this stuff and doesn't care. Steven Crowder is just trying to troll you, and you guys are taking the bait in an unsophisticated way. But the fact that Steven Crowder says the Nazi Party were socialists and that he's a buffoon, he makes an ass of himself in arguing this, that doesn't mean that your role on the left is to have a knee-jerk reaction where you argue the opposite just because it's the opposite of what this idiot said. Now, when you're looking at a totalitarian regime and you want to find evidence for what it was they represented, it is very difficult to select evidence from a time when they will be giving an earnest account of what it is they represent or what it is they pursue. This is a problem with all totalitarian regimes, left-wing or right-wing. So, I mean, or any other kind of totalitarian regime. So, I mean, if you actually want to know what was Joseph Stalin trying to do to help the poor in the post-World War II era, that's not something you can even easily get out of propaganda. The research would be, what was the government attempting to do? And then you can look at what they actually did and what the outcomes were and to what extent they failed. But what I'm going to throw up on screen here as an illustration, I took this photograph in a museum in France recently, a museum dealing with World War II and the Holocaust, the impacts of these things. This is a propaganda poster that was made by fascists for fascists. This is how German fascism was presented to French fascists after Germany had conquered France and set up what is called the Vichy regime. So this is a very revealing piece of historical evidence about the extent to which Nazism, National Socialism, still was a form of socialism, however terrible, however, depraved and corrupt and awful and violent. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying anything positive about it. Long after the Night of the Long Knives, long after Adolf Hitler had taken over power, not just of one country, but of a large part of Europe, because again, there's another excuse here, which again, completely ignoring the history of Italy, completely ignoring the history of the later period, there's an excuse here that says, well, there's this early period, this is the approach Three Arrows has, there's this early period before the Night of the Long Knives when the word socialism is part of the name of the Nazi Party and it really matters, but then very soon thereafter, Adolf Hitler kills everyone who was criticizing him inside the Nazi Party, and then it's not socialist at all anymore. Really? Well, this is long after, the leadership of Adolf Hitler has become unquestioned and, it's soaked in blood. No one's allowed to question him. That's why there's no questioning. And this is his attempt to present his ideology to the small percentage of people in France who might really support him and might really favor him after he's conquered their country, right? It's a very difficult political case to make. What do we read here? Contre l'égoïsme bourgeois, pour la solidarité humaine. Against bourgeois egoism, for human solidarity. What political party does that sound like to you? Who does it sound like they're trying to recruit or appeal to in that historical period? This is propaganda, but the propaganda itself is very telling. Contre l'individualisme, pour l'esprit communautaire. Against individualism, in favor of the spirit of communalism. Contre le capitalisme international pour le corporatisme français. Against international capitalism. Against. You get this? The Nazi Party was anti-capitalist. It was anti-capitalist from its inception. It was anti-capitalist during the Night of the Long Knives, and it was anti-capitalist afterwards. And that rhetoric and propaganda remains here when they're reaching out to the people who would potentially support them. So again, Steven Crowder is a buffoon. But on this issue, was the Nazi Party pro-capitalist or anti-capitalist? The fact that he's a buffoon does not mean that he's wrong about everything. Steven Crowder still drinks water and breathes air. Broken watches right twice a day. Can't be wrong about everything, people. And he probably does. He probably does read a Wikipedia article once in a while. Whatever. He's got to get material from somewhere to keep ranting on his totally phony, insincere radio show. Contre la condition prolétarienne. Pour la justice sociale. So against the condition of the proletarian, meaning against the oppression of the proletarian. That's what it really means here. For social justice. Still today, what does that sound like to you? Just think about the vocabulary. Who even uses the word proletarian and social justice? Who do you think they're pitching to here? Again, even if the propaganda is 100% insincere, think about the ideological function of this document. They're defining who they are and presenting this to people who they want to recruit, people they want to sympathize with them, against egalitarianism for hierarchy. Now, Joseph Stalin's regime and Mao Zedong's regime, and frankly, even the regimes in a little country like Laos or Cambodia or Cuba, I think it's fair to say communism in the real world is against egalitarianism and for hierarchy. I think they just wouldn't tell it to you straight this way. So yeah, there are differences. There are very important differences between Nazism and socialism or communism. There are. And if you go through this full list, you're going to see more of them, including obviously the overt racism and anti-Semitism. But hey, have you taken 5 minutes to look into the history of racism and anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union? It'll give you nightmares, homie. I'm sorry, if you haven't read about pogroms, if you haven't read about massacres of Jewish people on the Soviet Union, do a little bit of reading sometime. And you're going to find out that anti-Semitism was not unique to Western Europe or Germany. It wasn't unique to the far right wing in this period of history. And there's a very real body count for that in the Soviet Union also. And here you go again. Against democracy for authority, for authoritarianism. I think we could say that about communism and fascism equally. They're both authoritarian, anti-democratic regimes. Maybe the Nazi Party here was being a little bit more honest and forthcoming in their propaganda than the communists were. So guys, the other kind of bottom line here, I opened this with the leitmotif, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Very true. There's a question of how many years you put into something like this. And I saw recently a website from the infamous YouTuber Evalion. Evalion briefly rose to fame and prominence here on YouTube as a neo-Nazi demagogue. And she carried out crazy publicity stunts like baking a birthday cake for Adolf Hitler, and her racist views and so on were really over the top. I saw recently, just a couple of weeks ago, a website she made reflecting on how her political views had changed, what she represents today politically, and what her feelings were about fascism and Nazism in the past, and where she stands now. And although most people would regard her as both crazy and stupid, it's really interesting to say. I'm sorry, I can't share the link with you. The website's been banned. The website is gone. She just stuck with it. She kept researching the history of the Nazi Party and fascism and far-right politics, and she decided, as she learned more and more facts, she decided that she wasn't anti-Semitic and that she wasn't particularly racist, and she didn't support the genocide of or killing of any group of people. That was stated on her website. And she also found that the form of Nazism that she supported was the form that existed before the Night of the Long Knives, and she started describing herself as a left-wing authoritarian. She started identifying with this more socialist side of fascism. Now, it's totally surreal, but quite interesting to read that a human being went through this intellectual process of becoming an extremist, obviously becoming a kind of public laughingstock in many ways, and then figuring out gradually what it was that drew her to that extremism in the first place. Now, Evalion is banned from Twitter, banned from YouTube. That website got banned by whoever was web hosting it, and so on and so forth. So her voice is evidently being silenced in politics. But it was striking to me in seeing her, and again, this is someone we all kind of presume to be to some extent insane. It was striking to me that she seemed to really know a lot more about the history of what is fascism, what was the Nazi Party, how did it end up being this bizarre hybrid of socialist and, frankly, some left-wing features with right-wing authoritarianism, fascism, glorification of feudalism, going back to Christian values. Christian nationalism is a way to put it. How did these different elements come together in the crucible of 20th century politics? My impression was that Evalion, as stupid and crazy as she may have been, put years of research into this and ended up knowing more and being more honest about it than people like Three Arrows and the Amazing Atheist. So, shame on you.